Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Jams and Tea Podcast, where each week we come at you with a brand new episode. And this week we're doing a special topic, our first one in quite some time. We've been very busy at the end of the year. We're gearing up for list season, so stay tuned in. But right before we begin that, we are going to be talking about our favorite video game soundtracks. We've taken a concerted effort to include the more types of media that all of us are interested in this year, because we're all avid consumers of film and television and music and all kinds of things. And video games have been something we've dabbled in occasionally. And video game soundtracks, naturally, are the intersection between two of the biggest points that we talk about on here. So, of course, we couldn't go much longer without talking about what our favorite video game soundtracks are and why exactly they are our favorites.
And also just what makes a good video game soundtrack as well. I want to kind of just lead off with that because it can be a point that I think we can touch on with our picks, because
Mm-hmm.
a good video game soundtrack has to tread a really difficult line. It has to be memorable and distinct, and for like to be in the upper, like top tier echelon of video game soundtracks, ideally it would have to be the kind of thing that you'd be able to listen to in isolation as well. So it has to have this level of, compositional interestingness, basically. Yeah, it has to be satisfying musically outside of its game, but also it, as a video game soundtrack, it can't be too intrusive. It has to be the kind of thing that can sit as a bedrock without overpowering or, detracting from other elements of the, experience. Video games are in some ways the most multimedia experience you can possibly have, because more than anything else, there's an intersection of so many different types of media playing into that. And there's the direct involvement of a participant who you have to be able to attune all of the elements of your game, whatever they are, including the soundtrack, to enhance the experience of thousands, if not millions, of people who are all going to be very different in their own way and going to approach things from their own perspective. So, I have absolutely no envy for anyone who's in the position of designing or being a part of any aspect of video game creation, because there's so many different things you have to not just get right in terms of creating a good product, but that you have to balance within the context of a wider experience. And so our picks today are going to be, well, certainly I can say for mine as well, but I'm sure for all of ours, they're going to be soundtracks that are special in different ways, that have different roles within the game itself, that have different extents to which they work outside of that medium versus how they're experienced as a part of the game, that come from a wide range of genres, that come from a wide range of styles, that capture, hopefully, within our picks from the three of us, a broad sense of, if not all, then many of the different ways in which a video game soundtrack can be great. So what we're going to do is that we've each got three picks for our favorite video game soundtracks, and Jake's also stealthily thrown in an extra pick as well that he's going to lead off with. And so we'll have a total of 10 video game soundtrack picks that will broadly encompass all of the things that we love about video game soundtracks, the memories we have, the connections we have, and hopefully amongst all of that, mind something meaningful about what makes a video game soundtrack great.
When we do topics like this, and it's like, we pick a nice, like, we pick two or three things to talk about, and I picked my three, and then I remembered another pick and was like, I can't just do three of these. This is agony. No, I'm never going to have another opportunity to talk about this. As such, my honorable mentions are the soundtracks to the Persona franchise, specifically Persona 3, Persona 4, and Persona 5. And Morgan and I bring up these soundtracks a lot when we talk about music that isn't video game soundtracks. We talk about just like normal music, mainly because there are so few things that actually sound like Shoji Meguro's score for these games. There is like especially in things like Persona 3, there is a heavy emphasis of hip hop, of acid jazz, of drum and bass, and like stuff that just you don't have a lot of comparison points for, but also are like wholly unique in the world of video games. Like video game soundtracks are something that I've listened to for far longer than I've listened to like, music in a general sense. So I have a pretty like wide idea of what is, popular in video game trends and soundtracks like that. And Persona exists entirely on an island, and each three of those games have such a distinct vibe. Like Persona 3 has that kind of chill lo-fi hip hop vibe to it. The Iwatodai dorm music plays in my head on a loop literally all the time. Just some of the most that sax line is, oh my god, it's so fantastic. It makes me so happy. And I feel like that each one of the games has like a very distinct piece of music for all of the environments that you traverse. And the thing about the Persona games that's super special is that they are all about, I mean, they're like borderline immersive sims. They're like, you are a high school student, you're involved in some supernatural shenanigans on the side, you have to go to school, but you exist within this environment that's like in Persona 4, it's this small town in the middle of nowhere. In Persona 3, it's like in the middle of Tokyo, and same thing with Persona 5. But each of them have distinct vibes that the soundtrack embodies flawlessly. And the reason why these soundtracks I feel like are so beloved is because these environments are things that become your daily routine within the game. Like you go through like a week of school is like you actually going to school, actually studying within the game, actually going out and fighting monsters, actually like going on dates with people, and it becomes part of the domesticity of the experience. And if I had to pick a favorite, like most things with the Persona games, I'd probably have to give it to Persona 3 just because it's the one I'm the most nostalgic for. But the one I've listened to the most is Persona 5, which is the heaviest like rock influence of all three of the games, and also probably has the best boss fight music. That's another thing that these games do super well, is that not just the environmental music is fantastic, but the general like battle themes and stuff are every bit as memorable as something like the Final Fantasy themes. But again, they don't sound anything like those, to the point where I struggle to think of something that like I could easily compare them to. If you want a good taste for what these soundtracks have in store for you, I would highly recommend something I used to do a lot when like before the podcast started and I would make videos like just by myself, is that I would almost without fail always use the song from the Persona 5 soundtrack Beneath the Mask for like voiceover stuff, just because that's a perfect like background music thing. And the cool thing about Persona 5 is that each of the seasons that happens in that game, the music slightly changes, or like things will be in a different key, or the arrangement will be slightly different. So you get a ton of variety in and of themselves. That happens in Persona 3 as well. Like there's different like sort of variations on the core tunes there. Morgan, I'm actually curious, which of the three Persona soundtracks is your favorite?
Uh, uh, no.
My first proper pick, I guess, is my go-to answer for what I call my favorite video game soundtrack, which I guess I wouldn't technically consider it now that I've given it a little bit more thought, but always one that's been in the upper echelon, top three easy, is the soundtrack to Undertale, the indie game from Toby Fox, who is this incredible polymath of talent, who not only designed most of the monsters and the game in general, did all the programming and coding when he was in college to that game, but also composed all of the music. And the music itself is very much inspired by the same things that Undertale is inspired by, like Earthbound, for example, another series that has an amazing set of soundtracks, particularly Mother 3, one of my favorite games. Undertale is one of those things where it combines so many different aesthetic choices in the sort of guise of being this sort of, 8-bit retro throwback RPG, where it's simultaneously blended with a lot of modern gaming sensibilities. But the soundtrack in particular has always been something that I've absolutely loved, just because of its combination of catchy piano arrangements and the synth work that's very reminiscent of, the Super Nintendo and what have you. And like there's so many deeply atmospheric songs on this soundtrack. I just remember the first time I entered areas like Snowdon and I heard the insanely warm feeling piano arrangement on that just fills me full of all kinds of warm holiday fuzzies, to the almost stark atmosphere of something like Waterfall, which is one of my favorite pieces of video game score ever. I could listen, like, it's maybe, I don't even think that's 2 minutes long, and I could listen to it on loop forever. But the best thing about Undertale, other than the environmental music being like perfectly melded to replicate the aesthetic of the game and just sort of fully transport you into a world that, you know, you wouldn't feel like is all that immersive just by looking at it. But the real sort of highlight for me with Undertale is the battle themes, which are all an absolute blast. Every single boss theme in this game slaps like a motherfucker, especially the end game boss fights, which have been memed into high oblivion. Megalovania is maybe one of the most famous pieces of video game music, to the point where I guarantee that my two co-hosts, you all have heard this song, you just don't know that you've heard it. Because it's been memed to high hell. But the final boss theme, just like all of these insanely lush orchestrations that are like really over the top, and like they're like the equivalent of, like, you know, power ballads, but in the form of video game chiptune music. And it's badass. I love it. It's really emotional. It's really rich. It's really atmospheric. And the cool thing about Undertale's soundtrack to me is that there was an entire kind of culture created around this game when it came out, because of the hype that it carried with it, because of its Kickstarter. And one of the coolest parts about the soundtrack is that everybody really latched onto the soundtrack. And basically, like, if you type in like Undertale remix into YouTube, you will find thousands upon thousands upon thousands of interpolations, remixes, mashups, original, like, inspired by pieces that, like, people have fallen in love with this game's aesthetic so much that they've replicated it time and time and time again. And so there were, I just remember like being obsessed with this game when I was in high school, and then going onto YouTube, and I would just lose hours into listening to other people interpolate these songs, or make, you know, heavy metal versions of it, or just like, you know, different cool mashups from other games. So it's a nostalgic thing that's also really like creative. It's embedded into, it's like a core memory of mine of really getting into music and really like taking a conscious attempt of being like, wow, other people are creating this, and it's making this really interesting community that's thriving under a shared bond and love over this one thing. So I couldn't not mention Undertale. It's one of those things that I feel like is so big now that it's kind of taken for granted, but I still listen to this soundtrack literally all the time. Absolutely one of the best.
My first pick today is sort of an unconventional favorite, and for those experienced with the video game in question, they'll know exactly what I mean, because whether or not you think about it very much, the music, it is utterly inseparable from the game that it comes from, and that is the music of Deadly Premonition. And
I love this pick. Fantastic.
the reason I say that this is sort of unconventional as a favorites pick is that a lot of this music is not what you would call traditionally all that great. And
Much like the game.
yeah, and in particular, its employments in the game, where it's often louder than the dialogue, or just play at really jarring, seemingly inappropriate times, in a way that some people call avant-garde and some people call bad. And the thing about Deadly Premonition, and pretty much everything about it, is that it's a little of both. Couching it as this huge, sweeping, artistic auteur statement, or just a really poorly put together game that got nowhere near what it was aiming for. And the fact is that, much like this soundtrack, it's a little of both. Some of these compositions are just straight up gorgeous and haunting and really resonant, especially within the context of the game. And some of them are just a little bit weird, just a little bit out there, and it's not enjoyable listening in the traditional sense. This pick is sort of breaking the rule of, great album on its own, because for one, I don't think this even has an official release, and for another, I don't know why you would listen to this soundtrack if you haven't played the game. Much like the game itself, there's a lot of influence from Angelo Badalamenti's Twin Peaks score,
Yeah.
um, in the sort of really dark, weird jazz grooves that appear all over the soundtrack. But there's a lot of like really excellent guitar work on here. If you take anything away from this, is that you should play Deadly Premonition, or you should at least try
Mhm.
it, because much like the soundtrack, for all of its influences and all of its obvious influences, there really is nothing at all in any medium like it.
Mhm.
It brings up a kind of interesting aspect of the video game soundtrack conversation, which is how you create soundtracks that enhance certain genre conventions and certain feelings. Because this is a horror game, right? So I have to imagine that designing a soundtrack
Sort
for
of.
okay, well, I just was going from Wikipedia, but
No,
I'll
yeah.
take your word that it's more complicated than that. But even so, I don't want to say what it is yet, but Morgan, this is not the only horror game pick you have. So it's
Yeah.
like it's an interesting thought to me. Like, how must you design music for a horror game specifically? Perhaps a horror game soundtrack could be the exception to the rule of intrusivity, because maybe you want the soundtrack to be doing some of the work of unsettling and kind of really kind of jumping out at the viewer. Or maybe you want to kind of approach it from a much more sort of sound design perspective of just creating kind of eerie ambience. And so there's a really interesting thought here behind like how do you kind of stretch the limits of what's kind of musically expected to kind of enhance a game that where atmosphere is so key. And that comes to, and this applies to films as well, when like sound design and soundtrack can be so equally intermingled in terms of creating the atmosphere that the whole thing is based around in the first place. I'll get into that thought a little bit with one of my picks as well, but yeah, I don't. As I said, I don't envy anyone who has to create a video game soundtrack, but I especially don't envy anyone who has to create a soundtrack for a horror game,
Mm.
because gamers, I think, as well, are so resistant. Like, not just this isn't unique to games, but gamers are so resistant to emotional manipulation or manipulation in general, right? When you're playing a game where you're in this kind of like active role where you're kind of driving your experience to some degree, more so than listening to music or watching a movie. You're resistant to manipulation. You want to kind of be in
Mhm.
control. And so how do you therefore go about creating an experience as a sound designer or as a composer that unseats that sense of control? Because that's what horror games do fundamentally on a certain level, is they kind of make the player feel less control than they would typically be comfortable with, no matter what, how you're going about it, what the context is, what the conventions are. Ultimately, you want the player to feel vulnerable. And I don't know if how much Deadly Premonition leans into that idea at all, but I like the idea of a soundtrack that unmoors you or unsettles you by kind of being bad or like unconventional.
That is the name of the game with Deadly Premonition, is that everything about it is completely unconventional and on its face, like challenging is a word I would use to describe it, not in the traditional gaming sense, but it's very like all of these parts that feel disparate somehow congeal together to make an experience that you will just never ever have outside of that one game.
My first pick today is Christopher Larkin's soundtrack to the indie Metroidvania game Hollow Knight, which was released in 2017. It has kind of come to acquire a cultish fan base of obsessives, myself included. The biggest defining aspect of Hollow Knight that addicts people is the ever expanding scope of its exploration. It is a game that starts so small in scale and with you feeling so vulnerable and just expands outwards and gets bigger and bigger. And then when you think it's gotten as big as it's going to get, you discover more things. And Team Cherry, the developers that designed the game, one of their goals was to create a game where a significant proportion of people could play it and not discover half of the things that are hidden inside it, or could miss an entire level or miss an entire area just because they didn't find the right wall to knock down. And I bring all this up because when you're creating a game that has so many distinct biomes, that's all about discovery and exploration and finding new things, and you want to make that feeling of discovery rewarding, you need to give those areas and those discoveries a feeling of distinctness, a feeling like, okay, this is something new that I haven't been anywhere like this before, and I don't know what I'm about to discover. And a core way of doing that is through the soundtrack. And Christopher Larkin's soundtrack for this game is magnificent because it does such a fantastic job of making every single one of the very many areas in this game feel emotionally and tonally distinct. And that really enhances the sense of discovery that you feel when you get to a new place or when you find a new place, because it's not just that you've discovered a new area with new enemies and new things to explore, it's that you've discovered a new world, essentially. You've discovered, and if you're enjoying the soundtrack, as most people who play this game will rave about it, you've discovered a new whole aesthetic of the soundtrack that you're getting exposed to, right? So every element of the game is finely tuned to make that feeling of discovery feel as impactful and satisfying as possible. And so much of it comes back down to the soundtrack. It's a magnificent soundtrack. It's beautifully subtle at points. But then with like the boss fight themes as well, they're massive. There's lots of sharp strings that there's a real sense of kinetic energy to them, where the not just the movements of the bosses, many of which, especially in the later game, can be quite aggressive and fast. It's not just that those are matched by the composition, it's that the composition matches like the character of the bosses, not just the way that they move and the way they attack you, but just sort of like the sense of who they are. And the other big aspect of Hollow Knight that any fan of the game will rave about is the, again, like quite like Dark Souls, the sense with which it has a lot of lore that it just doesn't reveal to you, that you have to
Mhm.
actually pay attention, pick up on clues, and kind of interpret the puzzle and put it together. And the score is a huge part of that as well. The score gives you a massive amount of information tonally and emotionally that helps you to kind of get a sense of what story each place is trying to tell you, because it follows a convention of many games I love, and it's kind of a gaming cliche where you're exploring a land of ruins. You're exploring something that is sort of past its prime, something, a place that used to be great, but now is in a state of decay. And so the music and the
Mhm.
exploration have to not only convey that decay, but also give you a sense of the greatness that once existed, right? There's a lot that has to be accomplished through really small and specific aspects of art design and composition and creativity, right? So Hollow Knight does an amazing job of that. And the other thing about it as well, and this is one of the things that I think elevates any good game that's based on exploring and discovering, is that yes, the feeling of discovering a new location and exploring and finding new corners is great, but the beautiful thing about Hollow Knight is how packed full of moments of just awe it is, where you discover something, and yes, you want to keep exploring and find every corner of this new place you're in, but you also just kind of want to sit there and take it in and listen to the music, which is impressive given that it's a 2D game, a 2D side-scrolling
Mhm.
game. The way in which the environments have so much depth to them and like openness to them, despite the fact that it's a confined side-scrolling 2D game, is massively impressive. And
And
the
the fact
music
that
is a
everything
huge,
wants to kill you.
yeah, and the music is a huge part of creating that feeling of space and of it being a real world rather than just kind of the box that you're kind of the square box of your screen and where you are, on the plane basically. So yeah, and I love the soundtrack. I mean, the game is one of my favorite games, but the soundtrack I think is one of its absolute strongest elements, and it absolutely works in isolation as well because the pieces are so finely tuned to creating a sense of the depth in the environment and the creatures that live there and the history that's sort of subtextually buried underneath it. And of course, one of the other things that Hollow Knight is wrapped up in is the, almost Half-Life 3-esque wait for its sequel, which is been perennially delayed. And I mentioned that only because Christopher Larkin has released two pieces of music from that sequel, both of which I would say are maybe better than any of the pieces on the original game. They're that good. So Hollow Knight Silksong has a lot to live up to, and no small part of that is how fantastic the music is in the original game.
My next pick here, let me just put it this way. This is definitely a top 3 video game soundtrack for me, but even if it wasn't, I would kind of feel morally obligated to include it because of the name behind it. The name, of course, in question being one Mr. Koji Kondo. And there are no shortage of amazing compositional works that I could choose from here. This dude, if you don't know his name, has been a composer with Nintendo since Super Mario Brothers, and basically every Mario game since.
Do you know the song that goes then you know him.
That's him. And then
that's
not even where it ends. He's fucking he did he's done every Mario game, every Star Fox game, I think, or at least most of the Star Fox games. But I think anybody who avidly listens to video game soundtracks and the work of Koji Kondo will tell you that his best work is going to be found in none other than the Legend of Zelda series. And of course, my pick for the best Legend of Zelda soundtrack, probably the first soundtrack I ever really fell in love with as a kid and sought out independently, is of course The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. While I consider there to be a bit of a rough tie between Breath of the Wild and Majora's Mask for my favorite Zelda, and we've talked about how like in our Zelda tier list, for example, go watch that if you're interested. We talked about the key role that the ambient soundtrack in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom plays in that game, and in those games that they are not traditionally full of compositions or songs, rather just kind of piano-led ambience, which I like. It fits that game. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the traditional approach a little bit more, just because of how much it has stuck with me over the years. I mean, I could have gone with Twilight Princess. Hell, the orchestration for Skyward Sword, that's one of the best things he's ever made. But Majora's Mask kind of falls in line with a theme that I'm noticing of us picking, is that if they're not outright horror games, they're very horror adjacent. And as anyone who's played Majora's Mask will tell you, this has way more in common with Silent Hill than it does a traditional Zelda game. And now that I really think about it, part of the reasons that I love Majora's Mask is that it kind of falls in line with the same reason that I love something like the Persona series soundtrack, in that these games are structured around cycles, around days that you live out in whatever time the game sets up for you. Another one of my favorite games, other than Persona and this, that exemplifies that is Fire Emblem Three Houses, where you exist within a very set environment and time passes, and these songs begin to become fixtures in your brain because of your day-to-day activities existing in this game world. So you begin to associate them with specific ideas, specific images, specific feelings that really begin to resonate with you. And Majora's Mask has always stood out as being the soundtrack that I like the most, just because it is overridingly the darkest, most dour, and most atmospheric. Like even Twilight Princess has a kind of operatic grandeur to its soundtrack that I don't feel like Majora has. And Majora's Mask is it's just full of so many moments that I will never forget as long as I live. The clock tower theme from Majora's Mask, I think, is one of the greatest pieces of music of all time, and you'll hear it for 5 minutes in the game, barely at all. So I've sought out listening to it just so I can get a little bit more of it. But each of these areas in Termina is so distinct, it's so flavorful, and the music always matches that. And I would be remiss if I did not recommend that if you are a Zelda enjoyer, if you like this soundtrack, you need to seek out the sort of reworked mixes of from an artist called Theophany, Theophany, who has basically taken all of the biggest pieces from Majora's Mask and then rearranged them himself to be basically flawless translations of them, but like not in the N64 sound font, actually in like compositionally, like with real live instruments. And I don't think I listened to an album in high school more than I listened to the Majora's Mask soundtrack. It is deeply disquieting and frightening for like 50% of it. And the bizarre thing about it is once you get used to the atmosphere and environment of that game, it just becomes part of you. Like these things that initially seem really like gaudy and ugly and frightening ultimately become very comforting and strange. That's part of the beauty of the experience of Majora's Mask, is that it all feels so connected. There's a synergy here that I feel like is at its absolute strongest. And not to mention the final boss theme is absolutely whacked out of its mind. I have no fucking idea what's going on there, but go off, King. But really, it's just about the environments and how it manages to balance the idea of, you know, ambience in a soundtrack and like the tight, more traditional compositions. And Majora's Mask is a perfect melding, a perfect meeting point between these two sensibilities. And I love it. I love it, love it, love it. I would have told you that this is my favorite video game soundtrack probably consistently for about 10 years. Only semi recently have I encountered anything that I think is on this level. It's you got to play it and then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's that structure of the game that emphasizes how important these songs become to you.
Pick from around the same time frame, same sort of console generation of, you know, the PS1, the Nintendo 64, and another composer in particular from a very established franchise that sort of challenges you to pick just one score from their body of work and say that this is their best. And that is Nobuo Uematsu, known for the Final Fantasy series. There's cause to nominate nearly any of them as his best work, especially the run from 6 to 10. But the one that I'm going with is the first Final Fantasy that I really spent a lot of time with, which is Final Fantasy VII for the PS1. Not my favorite Final Fantasy. The remake gets pretty close to that. My favorite is 9, but it's certainly an excellent game that I mostly have minor complaints about, and it's more of a comparison with the rest of the franchise that I love. But the music is as iconic, as indelible to the medium as any of Koji Kondo's compositions, where, you know, if you have any exposure to this world of video games, you have probably heard the opening bomber mission theme, any of the myriad of battle tracks that are here from Let the Battles Begin to Fight On, or Those Who Fight Further, as it's also known.
The Airbuster theme.
And even from the more quiet moments like Tifa's theme or Under the Rotting Pizza, which is just like the most fire fucking hip hop beat you ever heard. The soundtrack really gets all over the place within a number of genres, but it's all filtered through the sound font of the PS1, which means that it's all sort of sonically unified in a really unique way. And this is why I sort of prefer it to the more far-reaching soundtrack of the remake. The remake soundtrack is, I'm sure, closer to what Uematsu envisioned to be in the game, but the original soundtrack just screams Final Fantasy VII to me so specifically. Again, it's sort of inseparable from the game, but I think the music itself is just so like Joe Hisaishi levels of,
Yep.
God, this is the best shit you've ever heard in your life, that it's like iconic as anything from like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings to me in some parts of the soundtrack. It's that it is really as good as it gets.
I feel like one thing that has to be said about Nobuo Uematsu's compositions is that there is no one, and I mean not a single living soul who can do boss music better than Nobuo Uematsu. And I mean
No,
specifically
it's
6 and 7 that have One Winged Angel and Dancing Mad, which are these 15-minute long progressive sweeping opuses that are like, when you hear this when you're a kid, you feel like the end of the fucking world is happening. It is like nothing is going to touch the scale of that ever.
I'm seeing new colors.
Yeah,
That is how
exactly.
good this shit is. And also, I'm scared. Why is this anime man so scary?
Dancing Mad is literally like a Dream Theater song. Like it is so enormous and opulent and ridiculous, and it has so many sections. It's like, how did anybody program this for something that is like a calculator nowadays? Like, how did he do that? I don't understand.
That kind of gets towards one of the things that can be a limitation of soundtracks is that because the way that soundtracks are deployed in games is largely as a kind of situational motif, where it's usually not a particularly long piece of music because it has no need to be. But then when you're listening to a soundtrack, it can be sometimes a bit strange to hear these pieces of music in a maybe more truncated form than you're used to experiencing them because they're set up as a motif in game and they're looped and they play for as long as you're in that environment or situation. Whereas when you're listening to it as a soundtrack, it's much more sectioned. It is a curated sample, basically. So I love the idea of someone who, while still working within that framework, allows for something more progressive or unusual, or kind of pushing the boundaries of that. I need to get some Final Fantasy in my life as well. My brother loves those games. He used to play them a lot as a kid. I never dallied with it, and it's just that's my. I'm making up for a lot of lost time with gaming right now, in the at 26, turning on 27 next year. So I'm hoping to catch up with all of these. A lot of the time I love having these conversations with you because I just like getting excited about things I haven't experienced because I get excited when I hear you talk about it.
One thing I want to note about specifically Final Fantasy 6 and 7 is that if you can track down the split mashup remix of Dancing Mad and One Winged Angel, that is basically like, there was this whole culture of remixing video game soundtracks in the 2010s that was like, that just skyrocketed on certain like weird websites and forums that I would frequent all the time. And there was this guy who could basically strip away different parts of different songs to like integrate them into video game compositions. And basically a dude went into the Dream Theater and Symphony X discography and took a bunch of like stems and shit and then made a mashup of Dancing Mad and One Winged Angel out of these stems. And it is the coolest fucking thing I've ever heard. It's so awesome. Like, I'm pretty sure I have it in my iTunes library from downloading it a billion years ago, but it is the coolest shit in the world. If you want a taste for how awesome and big these soundtracks are, give that a listen. It will blow your fucking mind.
Any conversation about Mobius Digital's to this day sole game, Outer Wilds, will often be prefaced with or very quickly lead into an emphasis that if you haven't played the game, you look up nothing about the game and you try and experience it knowing as little as possible. That's true.
Okay.
And it's not just a thing where it's like, oh, you don't get a true experience if you know stuff. It's a thing where it's like, if you know what happens in the game, it's literally ruined because the thing you get, the progression in that game is acquiring knowledge about the game. So that's a thing that every conversation about Outer Wilds is prefaced with, to the point where it's like kind of a meme in the community. It's like, oh, you can't talk about this game to people who haven't played it.
Hmm.
So I'm going to talk about why the music in this game is great without spoiling any of it.
We're really sad. Dong, dong, dong. Bong, bong, da, 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 da. This soundtrack rules.
This is a unique pick, at least among mine, because a hefty chunk of the music in the soundtrack is diegetic. It's a part of the game itself. It's being performed by characters in the game, not all of it, but a good chunk of it. And music itself is really core to the identity of what the game is. Beyond just sort of being a bedrock for establishing atmosphere or locale or whatever, music is a fundamental aspect of the unifying theme of the game and a lot of the ideas that it explores. It augments those things. And I'm speaking very abstractly, but if you've played the game, you'll understand. As a result of that, because of the kind of game that Outer Wilds is, which is on its face an archaeological exploration simulator that becomes slowly and then not so slowly something very, very different, it needs to augment the sense of exploration and discovery and all that sort of stuff that any other game based around exploration needs to do, but it also acquires an emotional tenor. The more that you play the game and the more invested you get in uncovering the game's story, that makes it genuinely physically overwhelming to listen to. I love this soundtrack. I've listened to it a lot. I have watched a lot of people play this game online because one of the things about Outer Wilds is it is a game you can only play once. Because once you know what happens and how to do things, that's the whole game. You can't replay it unless you want to go for all the achievements. So I've spent a lot of time watching people play the game as well, which is one of the most beautiful things you can witness. And the way in which the musical cues of this game acquire meaning through understanding the story, but also an emotional resonance through association, is utterly overwhelming. There are pieces of music on this soundtrack that if you mention them to people who have played the game, they will tell you to shut the fuck up or they will lose their mind. And the ability of the game to engender that level of association with music is really, really striking. It speaks to the power of music, but it also speaks to the power of video games. We've referenced games, we've talked about games already where you guys have said that part of the enduring appeal of the soundtrack is that these pieces of music, which without the context of the game, are good, but don't have that, maybe don't necessarily work fully. But when they have an association with something in the game, it completely unlocks a connection that is transportative and all encompassing. And that's so absolutely true of Outer Wilds. One of the things I love about it is that it's a instrumentally diverse soundtrack as well. It has, in some way, it has some aspects of unified palette in the sense that it's a space exploration game, so a lot of the music is kind of geared around emphasizing that feeling. But there's a very wide instrumental palette that the game utilizes for its different pieces. And the way that it augments not just the feeling of discovery, but the feeling of tragedy and loss that comes with that can come with discovery is really incredibly powerful. I would also incorporate into this the soundtrack to the game's DLC, Echoes of the Eye, which takes the core gameplay mechanic in a very different direction and emphasizes much darker, more horror style elements that is just masterfully achieved. The intensity of the music in the DLC is incredible, even though the DLC uses music a lot less than the main game. Andrew Pralo, the composer of the music, I can't believe I haven't even mentioned his name, does an incredible job here. It has this feeling of folksy, warmth to it of people.
Banjo.
Yeah, there's a heavy prominence of banjo, for instance, but it also marries that kind of folksy instrumentation with this real sense of like the vastness of space and the permanence of death, and it blends all these things in a really, really stunning way. It also makes you think about motifs as a musical tool in general, because it's not just how certain pieces of music recur in this game that makes them effective, it's how certain pieces of music interact with certain other pieces of music that make it impactful as well. And that's really the most I can say without getting into it. It's my favorite game. That's a very personal thing. Like it won't be for everyone. It's an experience that I recommend everyone have just to see how they feel it to be. But the music of this game, more than any of my other picks, is so core to what it is. So yeah. And it's like interesting because I think you can listen to the music without having played the game and have an appreciation for it and all that sort of stuff. But more than any other pick, I think the experience of listening to the soundtrack is so radically different when you've played the game versus if you haven't. Like the vastness of that it would be really, really striking, I would say. But if you want a taste of it, I would say listen to the main theme. There's certain pieces of music I don't want to recommend because they kind of need to be experienced for the first time when you play the game. Like the best pieces in the music in the soundtrack, I think, are so tied to core moments in the game. A great soundtrack, so many great pieces, but more than any of my other ones, so integrally tied to its game that the game simply wouldn't exist without it, or if it were different. And then that really speaks to how powerful and important music is in video games, right? And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this video is that not just, oh, we have these soundtracks we love, but also like I feel like music is like one of the most important parts of a game, and in a way that maybe isn't always appreciated because so much of game discourse focuses around, aesthetics, graphics, gameplay, movement, combat, all these sorts of things that are all important, right? But music, I would say, is so firmly up there with the rest of them. And Outer Wilds, I think, is a good game to point to as a demonstration of why that is.
Piggying off the back of you talking about the soundtrack to your favorite game, I will be talking about the soundtrack to mine. And it's interesting you let off this discussion by saying that like video games in a way kind of feel like the final form of art because it is completely reliant on the synthesis of all of these other mediums working together. And like you said, like with the Outer Wilds soundtrack, the game itself would not exist without it. And that's why I think video games are such a delicate art form, is that if you don't combine these things in a way that like emphasizes their synergy or a way that works together, then the whole thing could completely fall apart. So in a lot of ways, it's more difficult than anything else in isolation, is that you have to make what's in isolation good, but you also have to make sure that it works within the context of what you're putting it together with. And for me, it was difficult just because I've never really formally decided what my favorite game is. It's always been between two. And they're two games that are very, very similar, that being Fire Emblem Awakening and Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Both of these games are strategy RPGs that are based on the sort of tactics formula that developed on the SNES and lots of handheld games. My pick is Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. I narrowly went with Fire Emblem because I love that soundtrack. Ray Kondo's work on there is absolutely sublime. Ray Kondo is the guy who did the soundtrack for Okami, as well as Bayonetta 2. Guy like absolutely amazing catalog of music, and Fire Emblem Awakening is the pinnacle of what he's done so far. And in my opinion, the final boss theme in that, which is called Id Purpose, is one of the greatest themes in all of music. But I had to go with my other pick here for a couple reasons, because I do think it is my preferred soundtrack of the two, and it is also the one with the most nostalgic connection to me personally, and because this soundtrack, Final Fantasy Tactics Advances, scored impartially due with Nobuo Uematsu, who, as Morgan stated, does all of the like mainline Final Fantasy soundtracks 1 through 10, skipped 12, notably, because 12 is done by Hitoshi Sakamoto. Hitoshi Sakamoto is the guy who primarily composes Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, because the world that is established in the Tactics series is the world of Final Fantasy 12. So you have Final Fantasy: The War of the Lions, the original Tactics Advance 2, and 12, which all take place in the same place, and all of the motifs are like echoed throughout the different games, so you get a nice bit of continuity between these releases. But to me, there's nothing that I think I've encountered that has made me feel more immersed inside of a world than Final Fantasy Tactics Advance's soundtrack. And I want to sort of double down on something that Morgan said, is that you preferred the Final Fantasy VII original score on the PlayStation 1 sound font to the more updated orchestral one. And I agree with you on that, is that I like the new orchestral ones just because the novelty of hearing them, in high fidelity and, with this huge orchestra is really nice and fulfilling. But my love is always going to be rooted in the original, and by the limitations of the technology there that create a specific atmosphere that you can't get from like the live instrumentation. So on here, there's the original sort of Game Boy Advance soundtrack to this, which I don't know if this is like something that maybe came at the end of this console's lifespan or something. But if you listen to this game's soundtrack inside of the game in your Game Boy Advance, I don't know how it was technologically possible. And the reason I say that is because when you think about like 8 and 16-bit soundtracks, you have a very specific idea of what these things sound like in your head, because these systems had a very limited palette. It's not like when video game composers had to work with old consoles, they had to design them with the console itself in mind, making the noises, and they have a very limited sound chip. Whereas now you can just make and score a piece of music and then put the MP3 file into the game. So it arises a lot of opportunities for some interesting textures. And with Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, these compositions are so dense, so layered, and so clear. I'm just kind of baffled by them. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is a game that, like, it was very popular, it was very successful, it has that big franchise name attached to it, but it was also simultaneously kind of it's a side game, and as such it kind of gets to take a little bit more risks than your average Final Fantasy game. And anyone who's familiar with the franchise will tell you that the first Tactics game for the PlayStation 1 has like the best story in any of these games. And I completely agree. Like the Final Fantasy series is very much a series of high anime melodrama type of stuff. It varies in execution depending on who's writing the game. Playing one of the Final Fantasy Tactics games is like reading a George R.R. Martin novel. Like there's so much political intrigue and like espionage, and like again, they're tactics games. So you're basically put into the position of being very, you're very strategic. You have to play, and like every single move you make matters. These games are known for being notoriously quite difficult. They have very, very in-depth character creation systems and jobs and all that kind of stuff. And as such, there are so many aspects of this game in terms of like the menus, the UI, the shops, the overworlds, the battles. They're like, there are so many pieces of music in this game for a game that feasibly on a handheld console has no business being as long, as dense, or as rich as it is. And it completely immerses you in the environment of Ivalice, which is the country that these games are all set in, which is something I love about these weird sort of offshoots of Final Fantasy 12 and the Tactics series, is that they just decided to have continuity between these games for whatever reason, which I don't know what made them so special, but it makes spending time in these worlds feel kind of like extra meaningful, because you get to see different characters, how they've changed, and their musical motifs will like update. If you contrast the soundtrack of Final Fantasy 12 and the other Tactics games, you get to see how the music has evolved over the years and how the characters have evolved as well. So there's, again, a great amount of synergy there, but there's also just a great diversity of instrumentation. There's everything from like accordions on here to big bombastic horn embellishments. The tone of all of these songs is all over the place. Some of them are just absolutely rich with adventure and fun and fantasy, and some of them are dark and brooding and intimidating. Some of the Final Fantasy games, they get really high-minded with how like, their like imagery and how like weird and orgiastic they can become, and these games are no exception. But one of the things that I've admired about it for so long is how this game uses its soundtrack to emphasize the difference between the real world and the fantasy world in these games. Because if you don't know, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is the story of a bunch of real world kids who actually get pulled isekai style into the world of Final Fantasy. Like, it is a game within the context of the world, which is ground zero for my fascination with metafiction as like a concept. Like this is the first thing that introduced that to me. The soundtrack has a kind of companion piece in the form of an album called White, The Melodies of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, which is something I discovered when I was a kid, and it is basically live indie rock interpolations of these songs. Not the whole soundtrack. It's like 50 minutes, usually like the best of the themes. All of the Nobuo Uematsu compositions are in here. And some of them are done with these electric slide guitars. Some of them are done to be like really new agey and spiritual sounding. And some of them are just very like contemplative and folky. And there's such a richness and a warmness to the sound. I listen to this album all the time, like all the time, and nobody knows about it just because it's a really kind of obscure artifact. But if it comes down to the video game soundtrack I've listened to the most, it's definitely the Melodies soundtrack, which is just like it just takes these and puts them. Ironically, it kind of echoes the sentiment of the game, where you have the original soundtrack, which sounds very fantastical, and then you have this, which sounds like it's taking place in reality. So it's always been melded to the original soundtrack in my mind, and it's just got so many great pieces that like this game orients itself around a gameplay loop that once you get involved in like a battle, it takes a long time to finish it. It's not like Fire Emblem is a series that's very comparable to it in a lot of ways, but that game series is very streamlined. Final Fantasy Tactics is a little bit more in-depth and advanced and slower. So like any given level could take you around like 30 minutes to an hour. So these compositions need to be like amazingly airtight so that you do not get sick of them. And there needs to be a lot of them. And the variety is just fantastic. Just on a holistic level, this has everything I could possibly want. It sort of works within the context of the game beautifully. Everything I want out of the experience of being involved with a video game is here.
What to say about the soundtrack of Silent Hill 2? I played through this game again for the first time in a couple of years earlier this year around Halloween time. I believe this to be my favorite game of all time, one of the most important works of art that I've ever experienced. And it's not just that the soundtrack is integral to that experience or that it would be a lesser work of art without it, although both of those things are true. I feel like the soundtrack for Silent Hill 2 by composer and sound designer Akira Yamaoka is the game in so many ways. It is as fundamental to the experience as like the lighting system in it, or being able to move around, or the map that you rely on so much, or the fact that some doors in the interior locations of the game will open and some of them will never open, and that's how you sort of find your way through those buildings and complete the objectives and solve the puzzles. It is like as much of a character as James Sunderland or Angela or Mary slash Maria. It is woven into the fabric of that game, and for as many times as I've played it and heard that music and listened to the album, it's sort of become woven into my DNA as well, just sort of as a person and as someone who views and appreciates art, and as someone who it just experiences life. This is like an integral Rosetta Stone-esque piece of art that is a chunk of this much larger piece of art that is just deeply, indescribably important to me. It is certifiably a great album on its own. You know, again, I can't promise that it will mean as much to you if you don't play the game. So I must once again emphasize, play Silent Hill 2. It will it will run on your computer. You know, it will run on your calculator. It was like, just make it happen.
I will say I've not played Silent Hill 2, I have heard this soundtrack. This is a great album. I will play Silent Hill 2. Anything that any of you declare your favorite X of all time is a fucking priority. It's weird to be in a position where I know this soundtrack. Certainly Theme of Laura, especially, which I've heard a lot over the
Oh,
years.
Jesus.
It's weird to be in a position where I know and love that and have no context for it. It's kind of like actually um being a fan of Susumu Hirasawa's Berserk soundtrack and having no
Precisely.
familiarity with Berserk. I just love that soundtrack. It's interesting how this music that, as you said so eloquently, can be such a critical aspect of a multimedia experience like a video game, can develop a life of its own apart from that. So yeah, I look forward to what I'm sure will be an emotionally bulldozing experience, having that music recontextualized in the context of something that comes with such lofty praise. When I put this idea out there originally, I was like so sure that my final pick would be Outer Wilds because it's my favorite game and the music, like I said, is such a interwoven part of the identity and experience. And I was like, okay, there's no way. But this morning I put on the soundtrack to the game Disco Elysium by a band called British Sea Power, formerly called British Sea Power, now since renamed themselves just to Sea Power. And I bawled my eyes out. The experience of listening to this soundtrack, honestly, like so much of what made me emotionally respond to the experience listening to it this morning, some of it comes from the experience with the game as well, which is an incredibly, complicated, unfolding narrative that lets you into this massive scope of the internal worlds of so many different people and just lets those worlds and the wider context of the environment that the game is set in all develop such a dense history and personality, right? That you become massively attached to it all. But I think that even aside from all of that, this is an amazingly emotionally brutal album. On the one hand, it has this defining characteristic of this haze that carries across all of these pieces of music. They're bleary and blurry and sometimes not fully distinct because the environment that the game is set in is murky and cloudy and just hazed over with decay and disrepair. And so the music reflects that. But there's so many immensely emotional motifs that bleed through this haze. And this is a cool thing of listening to any game soundtrack in isolation, is you'll often discover, especially with more recent ones, that it's sometimes a completely different experience because so much of the weight and heft and detail in the mixes is kind of sort of sandwiched while you're playing it in game. You don't get the fullness of the sound because it is often, people are talking over it or other things are happening. And you listen to it with headphones, you're like, oh my God, there is so much happening here. That's doubly true of the Disco Elysium soundtrack. These pieces feel like not just these pie-ins to, socio-cultural decay and people who have died in some long, barely remembered tragedy. It is the sound of generations of fallen ghosts echoing across every moment of your waking experience. It's the sound of the burden of your past, which is the core thing that Disco Elysium is about being unable to escape the burden of your past and forging forward in the best way possible to try and build from that because you can't erase it. And that sense of the past being such a heavy weight hanging on you is so thoroughly communicated in every single piece on this soundtrack. It plays as an album better than any other video game soundtrack I've ever heard. The pieces are so fully realized. There's very few, if any, small motif pieces, and doesn't make it, better inherently, but it makes it closer to a traditional album experience than I would say most of the other picks certainly that I've put forward are. This just feels like an album, like a really murky post-rock record, basically, with these occasional excursions into industrial techno that befit certain aspects of the narrative. But there's so much of the feeling of buried trauma meeting up against the possibility of reforming yourself and becoming something better. It's just unbearably emotional. The entire soundtrack is just overwhelming. It's the only soundtrack album I've given a perfect score because it is just, to me, a cut above, both as an album experience, certainly within the context of the game, but just as a collection of pieces of music. It's utterly spellbinding, and it brings up inside of me a whole host of complicated feelings about how I live my life and how bound I am to the things in my past and the things that I've done, and how the philosophy of this game, which is a radical self-determination, which is kind of playing into on a meta level aspects of RPGs in general, the idea that you come in and you fully design and dictate the direction that the character goes in. And one of the aspects of Disco Elysium is how it plays with the idea that no, you don't really do that. You're always constrained by what the game gives you. And it kind of leans into that constraint by making your character kind of in so many different ways fucked up by things that have happened that are completely outside of your control and that you've got to work with as you try to drive the narrative. And every major decision you make in driving the narrative is, has to account for or is weighed in some way by this uncontrolled past events that are hanging over you. And, as I get older, I hate to be that guy, but as you get older, you start to be more and more conscious of the connectivity of all of the decisions that you've made and how they affect you at every stage of your life and the cumulative weight of that. And Disco Elysium is a game, that radical self-determination, that sense that yes, the past is massive and heavy and inescapable, but you can still dictate the future regardless. It's one of the most philosophically, personally profound feelings a game has given me. And the music of Disco Elysium is so key to that because it is that weight, it is that overhanging weight, and it is that sense of clarity and possibility and hope that peeks through the fog at every turn. And no piece of music is greater at showcasing that than the very first piece on the soundtrack, Instrument of Surrender, which is the piece that plays the first time you step outside of the hotel where the game begins. And it's just this wash of horns and just thick atmosphere that makes you feel like you are inside something that has caught you, that you are mired in this impenetrable mist that you have to navigate and find a path through and escape outside of. Yeah, there's two games I've played that have actually tangibly altered the way I think about my life for the better. And that's this game and Outer Wilds. They've both had that effect on me where it's more than just a game, it's something that actually heals a fucking crisis internally. And without wanting to make it about me, I think that the music of these games and the experience of the games themselves have the power to do that on a wider level. And it's not just so, I would say experience the games for that reason, but especially with Disco Elysium, if you are stuck inside of a feeling of being trapped by things that have happened to you or the things that you've done or the kind of person that you're perceived to be or maybe the person that you perceive yourself to be, the soundtrack to Disco Elysium feels like accepting that and then escaping it. And that is one of the most powerful things that music can do, I think.
It's interesting that we ended up, our favorite pick for all three of us kind of ended up meaning the same thing for all of us because it's all sort of embedded within us, like a real actual way in which we view our world or ourselves is the sort of overriding theme here, and I think that that's exceptionally powerful, especially when you consider that, like, the idea of the video game soundtrack, you kind of think about that in isolation. You're just like, oh, listening to music apart from the game, it's not going to have the same level of impact. But there's a certain sort of serendipitousness of just like listening to something divorced from its original context and that having that powerful of an impact on us. Like, I think that that's like truly something genuinely very, very special. And I'm glad that we sort of commiserated together to value that together. If I want to get all gay about it.
All right, that brings us to the end of our discussion today of our 10 favorite video game soundtracks collectively. Let us know what video game soundtracks mean the most to you. What are your favorite games? What are your thoughts on the subject? Let us know in the comments below. If you've got any recommendations as well for games you think we should play where music is really, really a core part of it, or soundtracks you think we should listen to, hit us up with those in the comments below as well. Thank you for watching. Until next time, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Toyota. Let's go places.